Welcome to the Wednesday Conversation. I'm Mike Kresnick, and I'm here with Pastor Bob Thune and Pastor Dusty White of Coram Deo Church. And every Wednesday we sit down to talk about how the gospel of Jesus Christ connects to the questions and issues of everyday life. And today we're having a conversation with the Dr. James K. Smith.
The Doctor. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. James K. Smith.
It's great to be chatting with you guys. Thank you.
So we're having this conversation after a long weekend of lectures that Dr. Smith's done here in Omaha. And so we're actually sitting around on couches and sort of distilling, hopefully, some of the major insights from his work and from the contributions he's seeking to make to our thinking about Christian thought. As you know, if you're a listener to this podcast, one of the things we value is thinking theologically about the world, about culture, about the church. And Dr. Smith's a fantastic mentor in that regard and leader in that area. One of the things that I appreciate most about you, Jamie, is that you have this capacity to sort of reflect meaningfully on where the culture is, reflect meaningfully on where the church is, reflect meaningfully on the experience of Christian discipleship, and somehow relate all of those things in ways that always seem interesting to me and resonate with, like, yep, those are the questions I have. So we wanted to... You've written enough that those who are unfamiliar with your work can go read and, in a sense, enter into sort of your conceptual world and the work you're trying to do. But I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about two questions. One, what were the animating realities that got you interested in the things you're interested in? And then two, what contribution are you seeking to make? So, this is sort of like, tell us about your life work, essentially, is kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a fun opportunity. So let's think, how did I get doing this stuff? And I'm a little bit conscious of, like, going back too far, and I don't want to bore you about this. But I do think if I try to make sense of how did I end up doing what I'm doing, I think it goes back to, in a way, to my conversion. So I became a Christian when I was 18 from a non-Christian home. And it was a pretty radical sort of, conversion, like everything, my life's going to be, my whole high school career, I had very intentionally been planning to be an architect. I'd already explored at the University of Waterloo. They had a semester in Rome. That has always been a trajectory. I took all the art classes, all the physics class. And then my last year of high school, which in Ontario back then was grade 13. It's kind of like A levels in England. If you were going to university, you went to a fifth year of high school. And I became a Christian day after my 18th birthday. And it was sort of like, okay, everything's changed. And by the way, my parents were totally freaking out. They thought I joined a cult and they didn't know what was going on. And I think it's because, and given the sort of the sector of Christianity that I came into, the only way I could imagine that was, I'm called to ministry. Right? Does that sound familiar? So I need to be a pastor. Well, the other thing that's kind of interesting, I don't want this to sound too self-indulgent, but I had not cared about school at all up until this point. In fact, I was just saying to somebody the other day, I think the only book I really read in high school up until my fifth year was an autobiography by a hockey coach named Don Cherry, who's very notorious in Canada. And his autobiography was called Grapes. That was his nickname. That is literally the only book I remember reading in high school.
Dusty, this has similarities to your story a little bit.
Yeah. So it's safe to say, when you became a Christian, you actually started thinking.
Yes, and I started, the irony is, funny thing is, when I came to my high school, I was actually placed in this kind of gifted track because I had exhibited abilities or whatever, but I didn't give a rip. Like, I just didn't care. But then as soon as I became a Christian, it's like all of those kind of latent intellectual gifts sort of like came to life or something. And so now I cared about things. So that quickly then turned to this sense of a call to ministry. And so I ended up going to a Bible college, and with every expectation that I would go into full-time pastoral work. That got sidetracked a little, although this is, I mean, feel free to interrupt me because I'm thinking out loud a bit here. What happened was, while I was at this Bible college, which is a totally conservative, almost fundamentalist, dispensationalist Bible college. Somehow I ran into the work of what we would call old Princeton theology. Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield, A.A. Hodge, William G.T. Shedd, those kinds of guys. And lights just started really going on for me at this point. So I was really energized by in a way, the theological tradition that they represented, but also just kind of the intellectual heft that they represented. And then at the same time, or maybe it was like my sophomore year in college, two encounters, the work of Francis Schaeffer, and I read an essay by a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga called Advice to Christian Philosophers. And all of a sudden, I started to realize that even the side of theology that I really cared about was kind of on this philosophical end of the spectrum. Like I can still remember reading William G.T. Shedd's Dogmatic Theology, and his discussion of the Trinity was like 2 chapters of Aristotle and Plato. Right, it was just it was a whole new world to me, and all these kinds of lights go on for me, and so now I start struggling with, real vocational questions, so that by the end of my college career, I had sort of reached this point, and I had a choice to make. I had applied to seminaries in order to pursue a pastoral track. And then I applied to this one philosophy grad school in the Reformed tradition in Toronto called the Institute for Christian Studies. And I thought, am I going to go on this pastoral track, or am I going to go on this more academic track? And interestingly, I remember getting some counsel at that point where somebody said to me, well, if you go the pastoral route, the pastoral training route, it's probably going to be a little bit hard for you to come back to academia if you thought that that was your calling and vocation. Whereas their hunch was, if I pursued the academic vocation, there was probably still going to be a lot of opportunities to serve the church from that space. If that sounds, and that might have been false, but that was kind of the wisdom I took. So I ended up taking that intellectual track and academic track, and doing an MA in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, which was also in the Reformed tradition, and specifically the Kuyperian tradition. So it's really where my intellectual framework gelled. And I think I was always at peace as soon as I made that decision. Like there was and there was something, I was already married and had at least one kid by this point. And it was something we certainly discerned together. And it's interesting, every once in a while, I do still get to preach some. I'm very committed to our local congregation. And I love, I want to be a churchman. But I feel I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But every once in a while I get this kind of like just slight thorn in my side. It's like, is pastoral ministry something to you? It's very brief and fleeting, because then I remember how horrible pastoral ministry is. But I'll pause after this. I'll say, when I was young, I think the reason I felt called to this pastoral ministry was mostly because I wanted to be a teacher. And I think like a lot of young guys probably, I thought of this pastoral ministry as primarily preaching, and I wanted to be a teacher, and so that was the track I was going to go. Interestingly now, if I'm ever tempted by pastoral ministry, it's actually less preaching and more pastoral care. It's like helping people die, helping people mourn, helping people marry. The pastoral care side of it attracts me more now. So that's at least part of the story.
Okay, good. So you're like the least boring philosopher that I know. Well, why is that? Like, because what's fascinating to me is you have an incredible capacity philosophically, but you're also very like down to earth with that. And I'm wondering, is that like a feature of your wiring? Is that an intentional, like, why are you that way?
That's a great question. So let's think out loud about this. So let me go back in that story just a little bit. So I became a Christian through the Plymouth Brethren tradition. The Plymouth Brethren did not have ordained pastors. So it was all sort of lay ministry, and it was almost like old school Methodist circuit rider kind of ministry, where you would go and you'd go to an assembly, a few towns away. You'd preach in the morning. A family would take you home in the afternoon. You'd have dinner. You'd nap, and you'd go back and you'd preach at night, and then you go back home. I started preaching when I was 19. Preached my first sermon Christmas when I was 19. And by the time I was doing later undergrad and then my master's degree, I was preaching at a circuit of about a dozen churches in southwestern Ontario. That experience of preaching, I think, and you and I have talked about this, Bob, I think preachers are often better translators because the nature of the genre of the sermon and the kind of audience a congregation is just teaches you have to kind of move the cookies to lower shelves for people to get a handle on this. So I now that I think back on it, I think that is not a insignificant part of my formation. The other factor maybe I would say is Rich Mao was for me the exemplar of the kind of Christian philosopher I wanted to be. So for those who don't know, I teach at the Calvin College Philosophy Department. We have this sort of panoply of saints who came out of that department, like Alvin Plantinga, who I mentioned, Nicholas Wolterstorff, and Richard Mao was another. Rich was a longtime president at Fuller Seminary. Interestingly, Nick and Al were like the philosophers, went to Yale and Notre Dame and did all the hardcore stuff that were read by the 6 other specialists in their field who could get it. Rich, I think the reason I see myself in Rich's footsteps is he modeled somebody who wanted to use his philosophical gifts to serve the church, and saw that actually there was a lot of philosophical need, like there was need for philosophical reflection and discernment in the lived body of Christ. He saw actually a hunger for it if people would meet them where they were. And he modeled for me the example of a philosopher who also wasn't too worried about people calling him a popularizer. I mean, people have to realize if you're in the academy, almost the worst thing you can be called is a popularizer. And when I was young, I think I really struggled with that. I spent the first decade of my career dotting my I's, crossing my T's, and doing my homework to establish myself as a specialist in a subdiscipline of advanced philosophy. And I actually think all kinds of academics who are Christians who nonetheless might want to be public intellectuals need to spend the first decade just becoming the best academics they can be within their fields, because then it earns you credibility and standing to then speak wider. So I did that, but then I started to realize I had some gifts or capacity to do this kind of translation work, and there was just a lot of affirmation of that, and I realized a lot of need for it. And so at first I started to feel kind of embarrassed about that. It's like, oh, I'm taking the easy route or something like that. I've now, I think more maturely, I've felt liberated from that. First, because I think it's my calling. Do you know what I mean? So I shouldn't feel embarrassed about that. Secondly, I am blessed to be part of an academic department that really recognizes a diversity of gifts of kinds of scholarship. So you've got high-powered, advanced, specialized scholarship, but then outreach scholarship that translates, and both of those count as scholarship where I come from, which is huge. But then third, I would say I just realized that that was probably more my pride talking than anything. Do you know what I mean? Like I was worried about, and to be honest, if this doesn't sound too obnoxious, I actually think it's harder to do the translation work than it is to talk in the jargon of a subdiscipline specialty where the 6 people who are doing the same thing know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, or they're hard in different ways. Mm-hmm. So once I got to that point, I've been very happy to embrace that, and I'm grateful to be part of an institution that sort of unleashes me to do that.
What do you see as your life work or your the contribution you're seeking to make? So it sounds like you see yourself as a philosopher, an academic one, but 2, as a translator and one doing that as an outreach philosopher.
Yeah.
What's your sort of, here's what I want to do for the world?
Yeah. I would say it's a great question. I'm honored to be asked it. I would say I just want to highlight how much God's providence channeled me into what I'm doing now, quite beyond my own intentions. And if you would have asked me 15 years ago if I would be doing what I'm doing now, I would never have had a clue about that. But now, if I look back retroactively and see why God moved me in certain places, in proximity to certain colleagues who were doing certain work that prompted me to do things, I see the tapestry now. And I would say coming to Calvin College, and in particularly working alongside my colleague John Whitfleet at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, has been a huge catalyst for, and basically, in some ways, I'm doing what I'm doing because John asked me to do it. He said, you know what, we need philosophers who are thinking about the dynamics between worldview and worship. And once he sort of put that challenge to me and put that invitation to me, all of a sudden, a lot of my background formation in French philosophy, I'm like, oh wait, Foucault was talking about this in the 70s when he wrote Discipline and Punish. Do you know what I mean? And this is like, and now he wasn't doing with it what I'm going to do with it. But now all my work in Derrida and things sort of came alive in a new way. I think now retroactively, if I looked back and said, okay, well, what has been that project? I'm not going to have a great answer to this, but I'm going to keep thinking about it. Some days I put it this way. I'm trying to teach evangelicals to be Catholic. That's a small c in case that's freaking anybody up. But do you know what I mean? In other words, I do think a big part of my passion and energy is helping contemporary North American evangelical Protestants realize that they are part of a body that is ancient and historic and Catholic in the sense of this gift of a heritage across time that comes to us that has treasure troves of wisdom for us to figure out how to live life going forward. So, and this is why I think St. Augustine then also became so crucial to me, because I just see him as this enduring, perennial source of wisdom, who interestingly is read in every philosophy department in the country. So it gave me a kind of point of contact. But to invite Protestants to realize that the church is older than their youth pastor, and that they are, no matter where they find themselves, they are. They should want to see themselves as part of this much longer conversation led by the Spirit. And I think you could probably categorize a bunch of my work in that frame, helping evangelicals become Catholic.
So a minute ago, you mentioned how you were asked into this recent work. How much of that, and then you also said you're beginning to see the tapestry. How much of that hard work before was just hard work, and then what would your counsel be to just doing hard work in your early years when it comes to thinking rightly and understanding?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It was in a way, it's almost like when I was doing that earlier work, I had more proximate, penultimate goals in mind. And not until later, when in a way this vocation was kind of pulled out of me by God putting people in my life, did I then see how it all had a snowball accumulating effect. But in the midst of it, it was about, in some ways it was just saying, I feel called to be a Christian philosopher. I think the best place for me to do that is from a credibility in the academy, and therefore, in some ways, to reach my ultimate goal of being a credible public Christian witness in the academy, I need to be a good academician. And so just get down to work and do what you need to do. And I don't think I ever felt like I was just like writing papers to get tenure, picking some puzzle to solve, because I feel like the nature of my work had always, this is what I learned, I would say, at the Institute for Christian Studies. I had always identified fundamental philosophical questions that resonated with my sort of Christian concerns and interests. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was just like the ploddingness of that. And now I see later how that gets reactivated once I'd sort of figured something out. Yeah.
You strike me as a person that has lots of interests. And I wonder if you are you the kind of person who just you can go deep in multiple categories, or do all these interests sort of cohere in some mystical way that we don't maybe see? Because it's interesting to me that you can do French postmoderns, and you can do Augustine, and you can do movies. You know what I mean? I think that's one of the things that makes you a good translator is you can say, oh, here's what this movie, start here and let me show you how there's a philosophical. So it's just interesting to me that it seems like for a person who seems like they have to be very specialized to get to a place in their field where they are credible, you're actually also sort of a generalist in some healthy ways.
No, thanks for that. I do have quite promiscuous curiosity. Maybe we should back up and say anybody who is becoming a master and a specialist of anything still has to be a human being. Do you know what I mean? So, and I think one of the great temptations is, and particularly in an age that so values specialization, is that you just lose yourself. Your identity becomes this specialist endeavor of which you are becoming a master. And I think, we were talking earlier today about how much small group saved our lives in grad school. I think it was crucial that they weren't academics. Because then you just remembered, oh, you know what? This is not the whole world. So in that sense, I hope I've always been sort of cultivating other interests. That said, however, I do think I was a bit monstrous as a young student and scholar, precisely because I felt like I was making up for a lifetime of not learning. And so I was so narrowly fixated on Bible theology books, that kind of I would never ever read anything but theology, right? Because how could I waste time on anything else? I'm almost embarrassed by that now, because now I hardly I have I read for work during work hours. I don't read theology at night. Yeah. I don't read philosophy at night. I read poetry, fiction, criticism, creative nonfiction, biographies. So there's something about, I don't know that I have an account of how it all coheres, but I actually love diving into things that I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Do you know what I mean? So I don't want to, because otherwise you're immediately instrumentalizing everything that you're doing. Do you know? So when I read biography of Richard Nixon or something, you know what I mean? It's like I'm just interested. Actually, I wish I could remember the author I have in mind, because it was like this psychological portrait of Nixon. And I'm just really intrigued by that. So I dive into it. Not until later then do I realize, oh, this is totally going to be in my book on Augustine, right? So I do have the luxury. It's a blessing to have a line of work where almost all of your loves can get incorporated into that. The sort of range of interest. And it's another reason why I stay in a Christian liberal arts context, is because I have colleagues who are just doing fascinating work in physics and sociology and political science and nutrition science. And I'm a perpetual student, so I'm grateful to be in a context where that doesn't go away.
That is super helpful, because I don't even think you have to be a philosopher, a theologian, or a pastor to appreciate that. Because what I hear you saying is look, I'm going to specialize in this, but I'm going to remain human.
Yeah.
I think that's a gift to culture, to a city, to the church for sure. Because you're just saying, I refuse to just get sucked into one thing.
Yep.
I'm going to let my imagination run wild.
Yeah. It might. So this might be, if we're looking for a cohering center, maybe another theme of the contribution that I'm going for is just unbridled holism about how we think of who we are and what we're about. And interestingly, now if I think about how did I get to care about that, both my training in this reformational philosophical tradition primed me for that, but I would also say my charismatic experience also just awakened me to features of being human. To be perfectly honest, I still remember the first day I raised my hands in church, and it was basically like an experience of remembering you had a body. and emotions, and that God made all of them, right? So maybe that sense of holism, it's one of the reasons why I think I'm so passionate about the arts. And coming up with, not that I can do the arts, but that I can make a philosophical case for why the arts are so significant to being human and ultimately, I think, mission, because they pluck strings in us that don't get played by our didactic endeavors. Yeah.
So can I ask you to reflect just briefly philosophically on, as a layperson, sort of trying to enter into your field and the thoughts and critiques you're putting forward. Here's what I see. I see Augustinian anthropology, which is sort of reformed but also Catholic, right? In the right way. I see the philosophy of, we've talked about like Dallas Willard. I don't know that you call him an influence, but just that focus on sort of the humanity of what does it mean to be a human person, and then to be formed in the soul or formed as a person in these categories of virtue, character. So I don't know what the tradition behind that is, but just that emphasis. So Augustinian anthropology, character formation as the core of Christian virtue, and then ecclesiology in a sense of like the primacy and importance of the church. Am I reading that correct? Am I seeing those categories are those actually there?
For sure.
What would you add to them if you're saying
that's
like
interesting. So I'm for sure. And what I hope is those are a braid, right?
Yes.
Like those three streams are intertwined. There is also, I would say, or I hope, there's something about a concern for really careful, nuanced, informed cultural criticism as that is intellectually responsible, that is attuned to the environment and time in which we find ourselves. And understanding the times, that kind of dynamic, and seeing philosophy as a servant in that project.
So we would sort of look to maybe Schaeffer or Hauerwas as
probably,
other...
I would say Schaeffer is probably, some people are kind of embarrassed by Schaeffer, and some parts of later Schaeffer I would be embarrassed by too, but I'm usually pretty happy to sign up and say, I happily see myself in a certain legacy of Francis Schaeffer. He was not a philosopher and a specialist, and therefore he's kind of ham-fisted about some of the history of philosophy. Fair. I think maybe this is also where Charles Taylor is an important part for me. He, as an engaged academic who is trying to make sense of the times. And what I've learned a lot from Taylor and Oliver O'Donovan, who's a British theologian and ethicist who's been really significant for me, I would say over the last 6 or 7 years, is a real attunement to history. That there is always a genealogy of how we got to where we are right now. And I think this is a kind of a new passion for me, because I think Christians tend to be a bit static and atemporal in how they think about cultural analysis. They think they have these sort of perennial categories that they can just place on things, whereas I think we have to be very attuned historical creatures who then realize that there's zigs and zags of history and contingencies of history that got us to this moment, and you have to be really ad hoc in the way that you do that. And when I get frustrated with fellow evangelicals, it's often because I think they are just intellectually irresponsible in how they do that kind of analysis. I think it's very flat-footed and has a tin ear for some of those nuances. Yeah, I guess maybe. I always count it as success if people would read my stuff and come away with a sense of how messy the world is. Do you know, I want them to come away with a sense of a sort of centering set of convictions and animating principles, but at the end of the day, I also want them to come away with a sense that, man, we're not going to figure this all out, you know, and this is where...
it's a blessing to hear a philosopher say that.
Yeah, I mean, now my philosopher colleagues who are analytic philosophers will say, well, that's of course what a continental philosopher would say. But I think you see it in Augustine. So the book that's coming out in the fall, Awaiting the King on Reforming Public Theology, Augustine's City of God is really the kind of anchoring text there. And what I just think is when you see Augustine analyzing the Roman Empire, it is a mixed bag. It's just a very mixed bag. On the one hand, it's a trenchant criticism of the idolatries. On the other hand, it's like, hey, beats the barbarian horde. So I'm looking for that kind of complexity. I think complexity is not something Christians should fear. I think it's something that we should embrace.
Well, I think one of the reasons I sort of have a man crush on you, unapologetically.
Wow. Yeah,
we could say that here. This is a safe, honest community. Is that I would say that I had intuitions that I feel like you put words to for me. So when I had these intuitions about here's how I think Christians need to relate to culture, and I don't really see it the way I want to, and here's what I think the church needs to do in worship, but I'm not sure where to look for that. And so I felt like as a church planter, I was sort of intuiting certain things about the church's relationship to culture and to history, and then I was so when I started reading your stuff, I was like, right here, this. And what it did for me is it gave me actually the feeling like I'm not crazy to sense these things, and good, there's people who know what they're doing in these areas that can be sort of tour guides for me and translators of how I need to sharpen my own thinking in these areas. So I've really appreciated that about your work, and I think I speak for probably many who
that means a lot to me. In some ways, that's the most encouraging thing, because I feel like if people read my stuff, it's like, okay, you put into words what I had been rumbling around for me. I'm like, fantastic. Because to be real, this is really truly honest. Stanley Hauerwas once said, novelty in theology is a sin. Mm-hmm. And in a way, from Desiring the Kingdom onward, I don't think it's novel, but it is just maybe a new synthesis of a bunch of different streams of thinking that then is articulated in a certain kind of package that people are like, you just named what I've been sort of going for. So that means a lot. That's encouraging to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to find out more about James K.A. Smith and all the books that he has written and the books that he will soon be writing coming out this fall, Awaiting the King, you can go to jameskasmith.com. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this week. Thanks for joining us, and we hope that you join us next Wednesday for another Wednesday conversation.